Hi everybody, I'm Kyle Tupper, and for this short video clip, I decided I wanted to combine my interest in the Cold War era along with my interest in podcasting and content creation. So this is going to be a short little segment detailing 5 of the most influential pieces of media that were released during the Cold War period, not just in the United States, but also internationally and globally. And for each one, we're going to go over the impact that each of them had on society and pop culture as a whole. So like I mentioned, it's not just going to be from the US perspective. It's going to be a good look into how different cultures felt about the Cold War, including from the Soviet perspective and also from just a greater European perspective and kind of the fear that was all over the world. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. So first and foremost, just a brief look at what the Cold War actually was and what the period was itself. So it started in the mid-1940s and it ended in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. Basically, it was a period where there wasn't really direct military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there was lots of tension, mainly about the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. The United States, as most of you know from learning this semester, was very anti-communist, and obviously the Soviets were a communist state. The US didn't really like the entire formation that the Soviets had kind of put together. And once again, there were no direct military conflicts, but lots of lives were still lost. There was still the threat of nuclear war everywhere, a sensation that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with as we deal with some of the conflicts that we have in the world right now. But it was really amplified during this period, and it was also a period of growing technology as well, which we will get into a little bit later on. But the Cold War period in general was just a great period of unrest. Pop culture was very, very interesting, which is why I wanted to look into it with this video. So our first piece of media here is a letter or a wire that was written to comedian Bob Hope. So we'll get to what actually happened with Bob in just a second. But first of all, it kind of starts with Joseph McCarthy, who once again we've learned about, but just kind of looking back at what he did, he took cracks at Truman's administration, saying that they were harboring communists. And in this letter specifically, he says that they were causing our boys over in Korea, verbatim, to die. So basically, once again, before we even get into the actual letter, just a fear in general of anything that could potentially be communist. Any slight bit of suspicion that somebody could be red in a government position was obviously met with quite a bit of terror, as we see here in this letter here from John Chappell to Bob Hope. So basically, Bob Hope had made a joke about how everybody was scared of being labeled as red or communist. He said that he cut himself shaving and was terrified to bleed, obviously because blood is red. But this is just a real show of how sensitive and on edge people were. This was all the way in the 1950s. So this was very early in the actual Cold War period. I think it got much worse than this as time goes on. We'll see evidence of that in our next few pieces as well. It got even more charged, but nowadays, when we see political jokes being really, really common and a very accepted form of comedy, may not have been as much so back then, and it's mainly because of just the national spirit that was so anti-red and anti-communist, where you can't even make a joke about something, like cutting yourself shaving and being terrified of bleeding red without being threatened. I believe in the letter they said, "Your number is up with all Americans who hate communism." So that's a borderline threat to a comedian who was just trying to make a joke in good faith about, cutting himself shaving and being afraid to bleed red, which I think is pretty funny, but clearly people then didn't quite see it as so funny. So it really shows how things have pivoted. And even today, we have some politically charged jokes that don't necessarily always land with the crowd. So it's something that you can relate to for sure, but just shows how much more amplified it was back then. Next up is another one from the very early period of the Cold War. It's June of 1950. The Red Channels pamphlet was something that was issued. Basically, the Red Channels pamphlet was a list of 151 actors that were suspected, again, suspected, not necessarily actually found to be guilty of being communist. So this could mean anything from having slightly differing political beliefs from the US. It could also mean that maybe they actually are Russian, or they're from the Soviet Union, or they're spies even. Now, some of these things may have had some basis to these claims, but 151 actors were not all guilty of these things. They were just suspected of being communist. I think this is really interesting because America is all about the idea of being innocent until proven guilty. And that's kind of something that you would think would be a very free American ideal, and you wouldn't think you'd be fighting against that because you'd think it would be communist to prove people of being guilty of something before they were actually guilty of it. But that's just what they did with these red channels here, and accused 151 people that had not been tried in any way of being communist, and it actually worked. It blacklisted them from Hollywood films for almost their entire lives. So careers were ruined, basically, over this Red Channels pamphlet. They were not given their due process. They were not given their innocence until proven guilty. And it's a pretty bad stain on the film industry and also the United States government in general, because they had a hand in issuing these pamphlets. It was a government issue as well as a Hollywood issue. It was kind of combined. So the government had their hand in a lot of pies here. Once again, it's a big overreaction to everything that's happening, especially taking good, hardworking Americans that are just trying to live their dream as film actors and potentially labeling them with something as horrible as being a communist, which really ruined their careers. Now, the third piece of media we're going to look at here is departing from the American side of things and actually heading across the pond to Germany to see how those people were kind of feeling. And again, this is a nation that isn't directly involved in this conflict, but they can kind of see what the fallout might be. It's very similar to what we're facing in the United States right now, actually, with all the conflicts going on, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, whatever it may be. We feel like we're kind of on the edge of teetering into something really dangerous. So this is the song 99 Luftballons by Nina. It's a song that I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard. It's still played on the radio today, actually, often, so you hear it quite a bit. And it sounds fairly nostalgic, fairly happy-go-lucky. It doesn't sound like it would be anything that would have much sinister intent behind it. It's a one-hit wonder, kind of, track 6 on their self-titled album, Nina. But basically, it actually tells the story of 99 red balloons being seen over the top of both the Soviet Union and the United States. And basically, it's a false flag, but the nations respond and think that it's the other side attacking them. So basically, it's like 99 balloons being released as a sign of peace, yet both of these nations see it as an attack. So again, it really shows how tensions were just on a knife edge, where something like a peace offering of red balloons can be released, and they drift over the USSR and the United States, and it's all of a sudden just a worldwide panic. Nuclear bombs are launched, and all of a sudden it's an all-out nuclear war that kind of leads to the end of the world. So again, it's a happy, kind of melancholy-sounding song that if you don't understand German, you don't really understand what's actually going on, but it's a really good indication of how those in-between nations felt. And again, like mentioned earlier, it's kind of how a lot of people, maybe in the United States, might feel, as it seems our leadership is thinking about picking a side in some of these conflicts. And obviously none of us want to be involved in, mass destruction or anything like that, but you have to kind of choose a side. There's sometimes a clear good and evil depending on your morals, but either way, if you're on either side, both sides are a losing side when it comes to a nuclear war. So those 99 balloons of peace are definitely something dangerous. It's kind of a warning just to stay out of things and not get involved if at all possible, but a lot of the times that's easier said than done. Now, the fourth piece of media was personally probably my favorite out of the bunch. It's actually a Soviet film called Neutral Waters. It was released in 1968, kind of at the heat of the Cold War, right at that midpoint. But it's a really, really fascinating film, and I have to give a shout out to my friend David. This is a film that's only in Russian, and he speaks Russian, so luckily I was able to have somebody to translate this for me. It was pretty interesting watching it and then hearing him kind of commentate it to me after the fact. But either way, it's a really great film, and it kind of just feels eerie to watch. Maybe that's partly because I don't understand the language the first time around, but it's really, really eerie because you realize that these are just people on the other side, and the people that are fighting kind of boots on the ground, even though there wasn't any actual battle action in the Cold War, the people that have boots on the ground and are at the front lines of these military forces probably don't really have the greater good of their nation at mind as much. Like, I'm not going to war for the United States fighting for oil. I'm not going to see that hit my pockets or my bank account. I'm fighting for the country, whether I've been forced or whether I choose to. So it's interesting seeing the similarities that just a person like me would have with a Russian soldier in the 1960s. Basically, the last scene of this film is kind of the most powerful. It's what it all builds up to. It's really the most important part from a pop culture standpoint. Zhenya Gridisov is the name of the main character. He's a young sailor from the Soviet Union, and he's rescued after his boat goes down by a group of American soldiers. And these American soldiers don't necessarily have bad intentions with him. They haven't shown him any reason to be suspicious, but the distrust is so palpable between the two nations that Zhenya has the choice to stay with them. He does have a briefcase with him that the Americans are interested in, but he has the choice to either stay with the Americans and be rescued, which at that point we're not sure whether we can trust them or not, or he can jump overboard and try to get himself to safety, which he does. He jumps overboard of the ship, and eventually gets himself to safety after being alone at sea. And after having this moment of triumph, this moment of rescue by the Americans, he chooses instead to jump overboard, which is not a rational decision, but if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody in that period, with all the tension that was going on and all the propaganda that people were fed about how evil the other side was, ask yourself if you would trust the other side if they wanted to rescue you, especially if they were showing interest in what might be in your briefcase or anything like that. So just imagine how you would feel. The last line of the film is actually a really striking one, and this is a translation according to University of North Carolina. Carrying out one's duty is difficult, but it's truly the reason we live. So this kind of gives the Soviet perspective on what the duty was, which is basically to just be true to your nation. So it's similar to what we saw from Japan in World War II, where soldiers would basically rather die. Not basically, soldiers would rather die than be dishonored or dishonor their nation. It's kind of a similar idea from the Soviet side, and I think a lot of Americans would probably admit that they had the same mindset as well. It was really just a battle between these two sides, not necessarily between their two ideals, and carrying out the duty of being loyal to your country. Whether that means dying at sea rather than dying at the hands of an American, that's a risk that they were willing to take. So the final piece of media here is probably my favorite from a pure media perspective, just the most enjoyable to watch, I think, and it's probably one that a lot of you guys have seen as well. It's the movie Rocky IV. So those of you who are familiar with the Rocky series know it details Rocky Balboa, who's a little guy from New York. He's kind of an underdog boxer, and that's kind of the story of all of the Rocky films, is that he's the underdog. He's not really expected to win in many cases. So in Rocky IV, it's basically a portrayal of the United States versus the Soviet Union through the characters. So the United States obviously are portrayed through Rocky, also through Apollo Creed, who's a retired fighter, and then the Soviet side is portrayed by Ivan Drago, who is kind of the prototypical Russian soldier, you might say. He's cold, he's workmanlike, he's incredibly powerful, he shoots steroids into his arm between fights, he trains by wrestling bears. The dude is an absolute athletic anomaly. But basically, he fights an exhibition fight against Apollo Creed. It's supposed to be just kind of a fun, exhibition. Apollo Creed is retired. He's not at his best. He walks out to the song Livin' in America as a big show as he comes out into the ring. And then Ivan Drago quite literally kills him in the fight. And Creed dies right there on the mat. So it goes from kind of this slightly tense situation to now there's blood on the hands of Ivan Drago and the Soviets, obviously, in this situation. So you would think, and this is where a lot of pop culture from this period goes, you would think it then becomes a story of the US versus the Russians, which, again, it almost always is in films like this. It's easy for us to see ourselves as the winners and them as the losers. But the interesting thing is Rocky basically schedules a revenge fight against Drago in the Soviet Union on his home turf. And again, you'd expect this kind of intense final showdown, which it is, but Rocky defeats Drago, which obviously you would expect. Hollywood, the underdog's always going to win. But the interesting thing is the Soviet crowd begins to cheer for Rocky because they see something in him that's like this plucky underdog fighting for good, fighting for what he believes in, versus this machine. So it's kind of transitioning from a US versus Soviet perspective, blue versus red, to kind of a man versus machine, man versus government, man versus conflict, whatever you want to call it. And then Rocky kind of stands up and has this quote that's like, we're all people. We're all humans. He's dazed, obviously battered from the fight. But he stands up. He's like, basically, you guys aren't so bad. We can all live together. So I think this is probably the most powerful of the group as well, because it doesn't take the polarizing approach. It does come from near the end of the conflict, 1985. A lot of things had happened that have kind of led towards the decline of the conflict. But I think this is a really good show of how things started to shift, where we stopped seeing it as country versus country, and we started kind of seeing people as humans. So I think that's what's really fascinating about this piece. So a lot of these pieces are really good indications of what life was like during the Cold War. A lot of them still have lessons that we can learn today, with kind of looking at people as humans versus looking at them as, a piece of their country or whatever it may be. So thank you for watching this slightly longer than expected video. I trailed on quite a bit, but hope you could learn at least a little bit about pop culture and could kind of put yourself into the shoes of what it was like to be alive during this time period. So thank you.